The city skyline shimmered against the fading twilight as the sound of honking cars filled the air. Ethan Hayes, a sharp-dressed man in his early 30s, stepped out of his sleek black sedan. His presence demanded attention, broad shoulders, a confident stride, and the kind of smile that could open any door. To the outside world, Ethan had it all: a flourishing business empire, a luxurious penthouse, and a reputation as one of the city's most eligible bachelors. But beneath the surface, a restless void gnawed at him. Tonight was another gathering of the elite, a grand charity gala held at a historic mansion in the heart of the city. Ethan attended not out of genuine interest but to escape the monotony of his perfectly curated life. As he entered the opulent hall, the hum of polite conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses greeted him. His closest friend and business partner, Ryan, was already there, grinning mischievously. "You're late," Ryan teased, swirling his drink. "Let me guess, closing another multi-million-dollar deal." Ethan smirked, grabbing a glass from a passing waiter. "Guilty as charged. And what about you? Still trying to charm your way into someone's inheritance?" Ryan laughed, leaning closer. "Speaking of charm, have you noticed how predictable you've become? Same parties, same women, same everything. Don't you ever crave a real challenge?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A challenge? Life's already a game on winning, Ryan." "Not this one," Ryan countered, his tone playful but edged with intrigue. "I bet you can't handle something out of your comfort zone." Ethan's curiosity was piqued. "Like what?" Ryan leaned back, his grin widening. "Marry someone completely opposite to the women you usually chase. Someone who doesn't fit your world of polished perfection." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "That's your idea of a challenge? Come on, Ryan." "I'm serious," Ryan pressed, his voice dropping low. 6 months. Marry her, live with her, and see if you can handle it. I'll even sweeten the deal. $500,000 if you succeed." Ethan's laughter faded as he considered the audacity of the proposal. "You're out of your mind." "Am I?" Ryan challenged, his tone baiting. "You're always bragging about how you can conquer anything. Prove it." The crowd buzzed around them, but Ethan's world had narrowed to this absurd wager. He wasn't sure whether it was the challenge itself or Ryan's smugness that made him consider it. His competitive spirit stirred, and before he could think twice, the words left his mouth. "Fine," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You've got yourself a bet." Ryan's grin turned triumphant. "Perfect. I've already got someone in mind. Her name is Clara. You'll meet her tomorrow." Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't back down from challenges, but this was different. Personal, unpredictable. He drained his drink, setting the glass down with a quiet determination. "Tomorrow, then," Ethan said, turning to leave, the weight of his impulsive decision settling on his shoulders. As the night wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the strange mixture of anticipation and unease. For the first time in years, he felt like he was walking into something he couldn't control, and though he wouldn't admit it, the uncertainty thrilled him. The morning sun poured through the expansive windows of Ethan's penthouse, illuminating the sleek, modern furniture that filled the space. Ethan sipped his black coffee, his thoughts lingering on the absurd bet he had agreed to the previous night. He had faced countless high-stakes business deals, but this was different. This wasn't about contracts or mergers. This was about stepping into the unknown. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Ryan. "Meet me at the cafe on 5th Avenue at noon. You'll meet Clara there. Don't be late." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. He didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't one to back down from a challenge, no matter how strange. By the time Ethan arrived at the cozy little cafe, he felt a mix of curiosity and skepticism. It was far from the lavish venues he was used to, modest, with rustic wooden tables and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ryan was already there, lounging at a corner table with his signature smirk. "You're right on time," Ryan said, gesturing for Ethan to sit. "Clara will be here any minute." Ethan leaned back, his expression calm. So, what's the story with this Clara? What makes her so unique? Ryan chuckled, enjoying Ethan's discomfort. You'll see soon enough. Just keep an open mind. Ethan was about to respond when the door opened and a woman stepped in. She wasn't what he had imagined, not even close. Clara was tall and carried herself with an air of quiet confidence. Her outfit was simple yet elegant, but it was her demeanor that stood out. She didn't seem impressed by her surroundings or the people in the room. Her sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the cafe until they landed on Ryan, then shifted to Ethan. She walked over, her steps steady and purposeful. Ryan, she greeted with a nod before turning to Ethan. You must be the man who agreed to this ridiculous bet. Ethan's brows shot up. He wasn't used to such bluntness. And you must be Clara, he replied, recovering quickly and extending a hand. Clara hesitated, then shook his hand firmly. Let's skip the pleasantries, she said, taking the seat opposite him. I know why I'm here, and I'm not going to pretend this isn't absurd. Ryan's already filled me in on the details. Ethan glanced at Ryan, who shrugged with a grin. Told you she's not like the others. Clara continued, her tone firm. Let's make one thing clear. I'm not interested in your money, your lifestyle, or this ridiculous bet. If we go through with this, I have my own conditions. Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. I'm listening. For 6 months, I'll play my part, Clara said, her voice steady. But my independence remains non-negotiable. You won't control me or interfere with my life. Once the 6 months are over, we part ways, no strings attached. Ethan studied her, impressed by her confidence and resolve. This wasn't a woman who could be easily swayed or manipulated, and that both annoyed and intrigued him. Fine, he said, his tone even. But don't think you'll get through this without any challenges. I don't lose easily. Clara met his gaze without flinching. Neither do I. Ryan clapped his hands together, breaking the tension. Well, this is already more interesting than I expected. As they left the cafe, Ethan couldn't help but feel that he was stepping into a game where the rules were far from clear. Clara wasn't just a part of the bet. She was a wild card, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt genuinely unsure of how things would unfold. And though he wouldn't admit it, that uncertainty only made him more determined to win. The following day, Ethan found himself pacing in his office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the bustling city below. His usual confidence wavered as he mulled over his next move. Agreeing to the bet had been impulsive, but now the stakes felt heavier. Clara wasn't just a pawn in a game. She was a challenge unlike any he had ever faced. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. His assistant poked her head in. Miss Clara is here, sir. Ethan straightened his tie, nodded, and walked out to meet her. Clara stood in the lobby of his company headquarters, her posture calm and assured despite the imposing environment. She was dressed simply but elegantly, her demeanor unfazed by the modern opulence surrounding her. Clara, Ethan greeted, his voice steady. Thanks for coming. She gave him a curt nod. Let's just get this over with. They walked into the conference room, where a meticulously prepared contract lay on the table. Ethan gestured for Clara to sit, but she remained standing, crossing her arms. Let me guess, Clara said, eyeing the document. A legally binding agreement ensuring I don't suddenly run off, and you don't violate whatever ridiculous conditions you've set. Ethan smirked, appreciating her sharpness. Something like that. I like things to be clear, but feel free to read through it and suggest changes. Clara picked up the document, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. She didn't seem daunted, flipping through the clauses with the precision of someone who had no intention of being taken advantage of. Ethan watched her closely, wondering how she would react to the terms. After a few moments, Clara set the contract down and looked him in the eye. I have a few conditions of my own. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Go on. First, Clara began, I keep my job and my routine. No interference. Second, no extravagant shows of wealth or attempts to impress me with material things. I'm not interested. Third, if you tried to manipulate me in any way, the deal is off and I walk. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. That's it. For now? Clara said, her tone firm. He chuckled softly. You're surprisingly practical about all this. I have no illusions about what this is, Clara replied. It's a transaction, plain and simple. But if you think I'm going to let you control me or dictate my life, you're mistaken. Ethan admired her bluntness, though he wouldn't admit it aloud. He nodded and extended a pen toward her. Fair enough. Let's sign and get started. Clara hesitated for a moment, then took the pen and signed her name with a flourish. Ethan followed suit, the finality of their agreement hanging in the air. Later that evening, Ethan escorted Clara to his penthouse, the place that served as the backdrop for his carefully constructed image of success. The elevator doors opened to reveal the sprawling living space, every corner designed to impress. Clara stepped inside, her eyes briefly scanning the luxurious surroundings before settling on him. It's exactly what I expected, she said, her voice neutral. Ethan smiled. Good or bad? Neither. Clara replied, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. It's just predictable. Ethan was caught off guard. Most people marveled at the sheer extravagance of his home, but Clara seemed utterly unimpressed. I get the feeling you're not easily impressed by anything, Ethan said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I'm impressed by integrity, Clara said simply. And to face him. The comment struck deeper than Ethan cared to admit. For a moment he felt exposed, as if she could see through the polished exterior he presented to the world. He quickly masked his reaction with a casual smile. Let's see how long that lasts, he said lightly. Clara didn't respond, instead turning her attention back to the view. Over the next few days, Clara began settling into the penthouse. Though she made it clear she had no intention of changing her lifestyle, she maintained her routine, working at her job, meeting friends, and keeping her independence. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself observing her more than he had anticipated. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Her confidence wasn't a performance, it was innate, and it challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. But beneath his growing curiosity, Ethan remained determined to win the bet. He began subtle attempts to test her resolve, offering her expensive gifts and suggesting lavish dinners. Clara refused each gesture with a calm but firm dismissal. I don't need these things, Ethan, she said one evening as he presented her with a diamond bracelet. You can't buy my respect. Ethan's jaw tightened, though he quickly masked his frustration with a charming smile. It's not about respect, it's about making life easier for you. My life is already fine, Clara replied, her tone steady. For the first time in years, Ethan felt genuinely challenged. Clara wasn't just resisting him. She was holding a mirror up to his life, forcing him to confront the emptiness beneath the surface. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the penthouse's spacious living room. Clara had gone out to meet a friend, leaving him with his thoughts. He stared at the city lights, wondering why this bet was affecting him so deeply. It wasn't just about the money or the challenge anymore. Clara's presence had unsettled something within him, a restlessness he couldn't quite define. When Clara returned, she found him still sitting there, a glass of whiskey in hand. She paused, sensing something different about him. Everything okay? She asked, her tone softer than usual. Ethan looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Do you ever feel like something's missing, even when you have everything? Clara studied him for a moment before answering. All the time. That's why I focus on what really matters. Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Doubt. Doubt about his choices, his motivations, and whether he could truly win this game without losing something more valuable along the way. The weeks following their agreement were marked by an uneasy balance between two determined individuals. Ethan's world, so carefully curated and controlled, was now invaded by Clara's unyielding independence. She wasn't just holding her ground, she was carving her own space within his meticulously constructed life. Ethan observed her with increasing fascination and frustration. Clara would rise early, make herself coffee, and read at the kitchen table, seemingly unaffected by the grandeur surrounding her. She declined offers for exclusive events and dinners, choosing instead to attend book clubs or volunteer at local shelters. She lived her life as if Ethan's wealth and power didn't exist, and that unnerved him more than he cared to admit. One evening, Ethan decided to push the boundaries again. He had arranged a dinner at a high-profile restaurant frequented by celebrities and socialites. Clara was hesitant when he invited her, but she finally agreed, seeing it as another chance to reinforce her stance. The restaurant was everything Ethan loved. Extravagant, exclusive, and buzzing with influential people. Clara, however, looked completely unimpressed as they were seated at a private table with a view of the city. "Impressive, isn't it?" Ethan asked, watching her reaction. Clara took a sip of her water before responding. "It's nice, but I don't understand why people place so much importance on places like this." Ethan chuckled, leaning forward. "Because it's a reflection of success. It's a reminder of how far you've come." Clara met his gaze, her expression calm but piercing. "Success isn't about where you eat, Ethan. It's about the impact you make. What does this place really say about you, except that you can afford it?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. As the dinner continued, Ethan tried to shift the conversation to lighter topics, but Clara's responses remained grounded and sincere. She wasn't interested in small talk or superficial charm, and her candor made Ethan feel more exposed than he ever had. When the waiter brought the bill, Ethan pulled out his black card, a symbol of limitless wealth. Clara watched him silently, then spoke. "Does paying for things like this make you feel better?" she asked softly. Ethan froze, her question cutting deeper than he expected. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clara shrugged. "You surround yourself with all this luxury, but it feels more like a shield than anything else. Who are you without it?" Ethan's jaw tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely challenged in a way he couldn't brush off. After dinner, the ride back to the penthouse was quiet. Ethan's mind raced with Clara's words, though he didn't show it. Clara, on the other hand, gazed out of the car window, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. When they arrived home, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the large windows, staring out at the city. Clara sat on the couch, pulling out a notebook and jotting down notes, likely something for her job or personal projects. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You're not like anyone I've met before." Clara glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It's an observation," Ethan said, turning to face her. "You don't seem to care about any of this. The wealth, the status, it means nothing to you." "That's because it doesn't define who I am," Clara replied. "And it shouldn't define you either." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "What does define you then?" Clara leaned back, considering her response. "The choices I make, the people I care about, and the difference I can make in the world. None of that requires a penthouse or a black card." Ethan laughed bitterly. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Clara said, her tone gentle but firm. "You're the one complicating it." As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself questioning his own life more and more. The bet, once a game to prove his dominance, had become something much deeper. Clara's presence was unraveling the carefully constructed image he had built for himself, and he wasn't sure if he liked it or hated it. Their interactions became a strange blend of tension and mutual curiosity. Ethan continued to test Clara's boundaries, but each time she held her ground with quiet strength. She wasn't hostile or dismissive, but she also wasn't willing to compromise her values. One evening, as they sat on opposite ends of the penthouse living room, Ethan found himself asking a question he hadn't planned. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Clara looked up from her book, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "The truth." Ethan nodded. "I needed the money," Clara admitted. "Not for myself, but for my sister. She's been struggling, and this was the quickest way to help her." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by her honesty. He hadn't expected a reason so selfless. "You could have just asked for a loan." Clara smiled faintly. "From you? A man I didn't know? No thanks. I prefer to earn what I need, even if it means playing along with something as ridiculous as this bet." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Her words hit harder than he anticipated. For the first time he saw her not just as an opponent but as a person with her own struggles and motivations. And for the first time he wondered if winning the bet was worth losing whatever fragile connection was beginning to form between them. The dynamics between Ethan and Clara began to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the days turned into weeks. What had started as a calculated game for Ethan was now something he couldn't quite define. Clara's influence on his carefully constructed world was undeniable, and her presence no longer felt like an intrusion but rather a quiet revolution. One morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen to find Clara cooking breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling eggs filled the air, a far cry from the polished sterility of his usual life. She was humming softly to herself, completely at ease. "You know we have a chef for that," Ethan remarked, leaning against the counter. Clara glanced at him and smirked. "I prefer my own cooking. Besides, the chef doesn't know how to make eggs exactly the way I like them." Ethan chuckled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "You're the first person to live here who doesn't seem awestruck by all of this." Clara shrugged. "It's just a fancy box in the sky, Ethan. Pretty but not exactly home." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. "And what does home mean to you?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Comfort," she replied without hesitation. "A place where you can be yourself without putting on a show." Ethan fell silent, her answer hitting closer to home than he expected. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly comfortable in his own space. Over time, Clara's unpretentious ways began to bleed into Ethan's routines. She convinced him to take walks in the park instead of meetings in stuffy boardrooms. She encouraged him to try cooking, a disaster at first, but they laughed about it as smoke filled the kitchen. Their conversations deepened, shifting from witty banter to meaningful exchanges. Clara shared stories about her sister, her upbringing, and her dreams, all of which painted a picture of someone driven not by ambition, but by love and responsibility. Ethan, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. He spoke about his childhood, the relentless pressure to succeed, and the emptiness that came with it. He confessed how the bet had initially been a way to prove something to himself, though he wasn't sure what anymore. One evening, after a particularly intense day at work, Ethan returned to find Clara on the balcony, watching the city lights. She turned as he approached, offering him a small smile. "Long day?" she'd asked. "You could say that," he replied, loosening his tie and leaning against the railing beside her. They stood in silence for a while, the cool breeze brushing past them. "Do you ever wonder why you're doing all this?" Clara asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "All the deals, the power plays, the constant need to win. What's the endgame?" Ethan sighed, her question weighing heavily on him. "I guess I've never really thought about it. Winning was always the goal." "And now?" Clara asked, turning to face him. Ethan hesitated, then met her eyes. "Now? I'm not so sure." Clara's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. Despite the growing connection, the shadow of the bet loomed over their relationship. Ethan found himself increasingly torn. The 6-month deadline was approaching, and with it, the expectation that this arrangement would end. One night, while reviewing documents in his study, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Jack. "How's the bet going? Ready to claim your victory yet?" Ethan stared at the message, a bitter taste rising in his mouth. Claiming victory didn't feel as satisfying as it once had. Instead, the idea filled him with unease. He realized that what he truly wanted had shifted. The game no longer mattered. Clara did. Her unwavering integrity, her kindness, and her ability to challenge him in ways no one else ever had were far more valuable than any bet. Ethan began to grapple with a truth he had been avoiding. If Clara ever found out about the bet, it would destroy the fragile trust they had built. The thought of losing her, of watching her walk away, gnawed at him. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a documentary Clara had chosen, Ethan couldn't shake the weight of his secret. "Clara," he said hesitantly, turning to face her. She looked at him, her eyes warm but curious. "What is it?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. The words felt stuck in his throat, tangled with fear and guilt. "Nothing," he said finally, forcing a smile. "Just, thanks for being here." Clara smiled back, though her expression held a hint of suspicion. "Where else would I be?" Ethan's heart etched at her answer, knowing that her trust was something he didn't fully deserve. As the days passed, Ethan found himself increasingly desperate to make things right. He started spending less time at work, prioritizing moments with Clara. He supported her causes, attended her volunteer events, and even started reading books she recommended. But no matter what he did, the secret of the bet loomed over him like a ticking time bomb. For the first time in his life, Ethan Marshall, the man who always played to win, feared losing more than anything else, and this time the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. The day of reckoning was drawing near, and Ethan could feel the tension building between him and Clara. As the weeks passed, every interaction seemed to carry a heavier weight, every moment seemed to matter more. The 6-month deadline was less than a month away, and Ethan knew he couldn't delay the inevitable confrontation any longer. Ethan spent the early hours pacing his office, his mind racing with the decision that lay before him. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the glossy surface of his desk. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the gnawing doubt about what he was about to do. At Clara's suggestion, they had started seeing a couples therapist a few weeks earlier. It had been Clara's idea, and Ethan had reluctantly agreed, not fully understanding how much it would reveal about himself. The therapist had been insightful, often pointing out that Ethan's need to control everything was what had led him into this bet in the first place. Each session was a painful reminder of just how much he had allowed his pride and insecurities to dictate his choices. That evening, Ethan arrived home with a determined expression, finding Clara already waiting for him in the living room, her usual calm demeanor unshaken. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ethan knew they needed to talk about what was coming. "Do you want to sit down?" Clara asked, her voice steady. Ethan nodded, sinking into the couch across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them. "Ethan, what's really going on?" Clara finally asked, her voice soft yet firm. "You've been different lately, more distant, more intense." Ethan clenched his hands together, his gaze focused on the floor. "I have something to tell you," he said quietly. Clara didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. Ethan took a deep breath, then finally looked up at her. "The bet, it wasn't just a game to me," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "When Jack suggested it, I saw it as a way to prove myself, prove that I was more than just a pretty face and a wealthy lifestyle." Clara's eyes narrowed, a mix of anger and hurt passing through them. "And what exactly did you have to prove, Ethan?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, gathering his thoughts. "That I could be more than the man everyone expects me to be, that I could be better. But it wasn't just about winning the money anymore. It was about losing control, about letting go of everything I thought I wanted." Clara leaned back, her arms crossed over her chest. "So what was this all for then?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. Were you really trying to understand who I am, or were you just trying to win? Ethan looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Both, I guess, he admitted. I wanted to understand you, but I also wanted to prove that I could still win. That I wasn't just a pawn in some game. Clara's expression softened and she reached out, gently placing a hand on his. Ethan, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were actually afraid of losing. Ethan took a shuddering breath, nodding. I am, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time in my life, I'm actually scared of losing something that matters more than money or power. Clara squeezed his hand gently. Losing doesn't mean you're a failure, she said softly. Sometimes it just means you have to let go of something that's not right for you. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. What if I lose you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes were filled with empathy as she looked at him. Then I guess we both need to decide if this bet was worth it. The following days were marked by a newfound honesty between Ethan and Clara. They continued their sessions with the therapist, talking through their fears, their insecurities, and their pasts. Ethan realized that his entire life had been a series of bets he had made to validate his own worth. But Clara had shown him that there was a different way to live, a way that didn't rely on wealth or control. One evening, after another session, Ethan and Clara sat together on the balcony, watching the sun set over the city. The atmosphere between them was calm, a contrast to the stormy days that had come before. You know, Ethan said after a long silence, maybe this bet was exactly what I needed. Clara glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. What do you mean? Ethan turned to face her fully. It forced me to confront a lot of things about myself, about what's important and what isn't. And in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about realizing that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. As the 6-month deadline approached, Ethan knew he had a choice to make. He could walk away from Clara, claim his $1 million prize, and return to his old life, or he could choose to build something real with her, something that wasn't about power or control, but about mutual respect and love. On the night before the bet was set to end, Ethan didn't go home immediately after work. Instead, he made a reservation at a small, intimate restaurant, a place he knew Clara had been wanting to visit. He spent the evening talking to her about their future, about the possibilities that lay ahead if they chose each other. When they returned to the penthouse, Ethan turned to face Clara, his expression serious. Clara, I don't know if I can make it up to you, but I want to try, he said, his voice steady. I'm asking you to stay, to be with me, not because of a bet, but because we're better together. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions. And if I say no? Ethan's heart clenched, but he held her gaze steady. Then I'll accept it and wish you all the best, he said quietly. But I hope you'll consider giving us a chance. The next morning, Ethan woke early, the weight of his decision heavy on his mind. He took a long shower, then dressed in his usual crisp attire, not sure what to expect when Clara came downstairs. When she appeared, looking thoughtful and calm, Ethan took a step toward her, his heart pounding. Clara, he began, but she held up a hand, stopping him. Ethan, let's just go take a walk, she said, her voice steady. I need some time to think. Ethan nodded, following her out of the penthouse and into the bustling streets of New York. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the city, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt hopeful. As they walked, Clara spoke quietly, sharing her thoughts about the bet, about their relationship, and about what mattered most to her. Ethan listened, really listened, for the first time in a long time. He felt a sense of peace knowing that whatever the outcome, he had made a choice to be true to himself. When they returned to the penthouse hours later, Clara turned to face him, her eyes clear and calm. I thought about what you said, she said, her voice steady. And I think, maybe it's worth trying to build something real. Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he smiled, relief washing over him. So, does this mean? Clara stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. It means we're going to take things slow, she said softly. No bets, no games, just us, figuring it out one day at a time. Ethan held her tightly, the warmth of her embrace filling the space between them. As the sun set over the city, he knew he had made the right choice. To choose love over wealth, authenticity over control. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Marshall wasn't afraid of losing, because he had already won something much more valuable. The days that followed were a mix of uncertainty and hope for Ethan and Clara. The decision to continue their relationship without the pressure of the bet lifted a weight off Ethan's shoulders, but it also brought a new set of challenges. They were no longer just fighting to win $1 million prize. They were fighting for a future together. Ethan's world was different now. Gone were the flashy events, the superficial interactions, and the constant need to prove himself. Instead, he found himself focusing on the small moments, quiet dinners, walks in the park, and late-night conversations about their hopes and dreams. It was strange, but Ethan was beginning to like it. Clara, too, was different. Her confidence had grown, her sense of self more pronounced than ever. She wasn't just the woman he had married for a bet. She was his partner, his equal, and the person who had helped him see beyond his own limitations. The couple decided to continue their sessions with the therapist, though now it was less about salvaging a broken relationship and more about understanding each other better. Each week, they uncovered more about themselves, their pasts, and what they wanted for their future together. As their connection grew, so did the awareness of the complexities of their relationship. Clara was still wary of giving in completely to the lifestyle Ethan had lived for years. She was determined to maintain her independence, and Ethan respected that, knowing it was a crucial part of who she was. Ethan began to see how his past had shaped him, how the desire to control everything was rooted in his fear of vulnerability and loss. It was humbling to realize how much he had missed out on by living his life behind a mask of wealth and power. Their conversations grew deeper, the discussions more meaningful. Ethan found himself listening more, truly understanding Clara's perspective on life, love, and what mattered most. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements, arguments about the future, and fears of the unknown, but they were facing them together. One evening as they sat on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out over the city, Ethan turned to Clara. "I never thought I'd be saying this," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "but I'm glad for that bet." Clara looked over at him, her expression unreadable. "Why's that?" she asked after a moment. Ethan took a deep breath. "It made me realize that I was living a lie, that I wasn't really living at all," he said quietly. "For the first time, I'm not just existing to impress people or to win. I'm actually living for myself, with you." Clara reached over, taking his hand. "It wasn't just a bet for me, either," she said, her voice steady. "It was a way to see if we were really compatible, if we could be more than what everyone expected us to be." Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand. "And now that we know we have a choice," he said, "we can keep this going, make it real, or we can walk away." The next few weeks were a period of exploration for Ethan and Clara. They tried new activities together, traveled to places they had never been, and learned to navigate the real world beyond the luxury they had been accustomed to. It was a challenge for Ethan, who had spent so long in a bubble of excess. But it was a challenge he welcomed. One night, Ethan surprised Clara by cooking dinner, a simple homemade meal that he had never attempted before. As they sat at the kitchen table, eating their food with laughter and conversation, Ethan realized that this was the kind of life he wanted, one built on love, trust, and shared experiences, not material things. "Who would have thought, right?" Ethan said, his voice low and amused as he pushed his empty plate away. "You, me in a small apartment, eating takeout." Clara smiled, her eyes warm as she leaned over and kissed him softly. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they approached the 6-month mark, Ethan and Clara had a conversation about what came next. The past 6 months had been transformative for both of them, and neither was willing to go back to the way things were. They had become different people, more grounded, more aware of what mattered. Clara took Ethan's hands in hers, looking him in the eyes. "Ethan, I'm not going to lie. It's been hard, and there have been times when I wanted to give up," she said softly. "But I don't want to walk away from us." Ethan nodded, squeezing her hands tightly. "And I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice steady. "So let's take this to the next level. No more bets, no more games. Let's make a real commitment together." Their last day of the bet was spent quietly, just the two of them at home, reminiscing about how far they had come. Ethan took Clara's hand, and together they looked out over the city, the place that had become their home in the past 6 months. "Clara, I know we've had our differences," Ethan said softly, his voice full of sincerity, "but I wouldn't change a thing. This was the wake-up call I needed to see what was really important." Clara turned to face him, a gentle smile on her lips. "Me too, Ethan," she said quietly. "Maybe it took a bet to make us realize what really matters, but we found it. Ourselves, each other." Ethan kissed her then, a slow, deliberate kiss that was more promise than reassurance. It was a moment of clarity, a moment that said they were ready to move forward, to build something lasting, something true. As the sun set over the city that evening, Ethan and Clara stood hand in hand, watching the sky change colors. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was on solid ground, and he knew that no matter what the future held, he wasn't afraid, because he was finally living his life for himself. "Ready for the next chapter?" Ethan asked, his voice steady and hopeful. Clara looked over at him, her eyes shining with love and confidence. "I'm ready," she said, squeezing his hand tightly. "Let's start fresh, together." And with that, Ethan and Clara stepped into the next phase of their lives, one that wasn't defined by wealth or power, but by love, choice, and the belief that they were better together. As the 6-month mark approached, Ethan and Clara's relationship was in a delicate balance. The end of their bet was imminent, and with it came the uncertainty of what would happen next. Both had grown so accustomed to each other's presence, their routines, and their shared moments that the thought of going their separate ways felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. The countdown was on. Ethan and Clara had agreed to meet with the lawyer on a quiet Tuesday evening, the same lawyer who had drawn up their marriage contract in the first place. The tension in the air was palpable as they sat across from him in his office, each with their own thoughts about what the future held. "Thank you both for coming," the lawyer said, his voice calm and professional as he adjusted his glasses. "We need to go over the details one last time before we finalize everything." Ethan and Clara exchanged a brief look, the unspoken question in their eyes. "What now?" "First," the lawyer continued, "we need to discuss the terms of the bet's conclusion. Are we proceeding with the original agreement?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes focused on the lawyer. "We've talked about this," he said, his voice steady. "Clara and I both know what's at stake here, and it's more than just money now." The lawyer nodded, a small smile on his lips. "I can see that," he said, looking between Ethan and Clara. "So, what are your plans moving forward?" Clara took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her purse. "Ethan and I have been talking," she said quietly, "and we've decided that we don't want this to end with the 6 months. We want more." Ethan reached over, taking her hand in his. "We're ready for something real," he said, his voice firm. "We want to build a life together, not just prove a point." The lawyer watched them, his gaze thoughtful. "That's a big decision," he said, his tone reflective. "Are you sure this is what you both want?" Ethan and Clara exchanged another look, one filled with understanding and commitment. "Yes," Clara said, her voice resolute. "We're sure." The lawyer smiled, his expression one of approval. "Then let's make it official," he said, his voice warm. "We'll draw up a new contract, a real one this time, one that's based on mutual love and respect, not just a bet." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Ethan and Clara prepared for their new life together. They moved out of the penthouse, leaving behind the excess that had defined their previous 6 months, and settled into a small apartment that felt more like a home than a status symbol. Ethan's first step towards change was giving up his high-powered job in finance, choosing instead to work in a community center, helping underprivileged kids. Clara continued with her job, though now it was more than just a paycheck. She saw it as a way to give back to the community that had accepted her and Ethan with open arms. Their new life was simple, filled with everyday joys and challenges that brought them closer together. As they unpacked boxes in their new apartment, Ethan looked around, a sense of purpose settling in his chest. "I never thought I'd be doing this," he said, his voice soft as he lifted a box of books. "But it feels right, you know?" Clara smiled, crossing the room to help him. "It's different, but it's ours," she said, her voice full of affection. "And that's what matters." Ethan leaned over, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We're really doing this," he murmured. "Building a life together, one step at a time." Their relationship continued to deepen as they faced the challenges of their new world together. Ethan had to learn to let go of his need for control, to trust in Clara's strength and decisions. Clara, in turn, had to learn to be more vulnerable, to let Ethan into parts of her life that she had kept hidden for so long. One night as they sat on the couch, Ethan turned to Clara, his expression serious. "I was thinking," he began slowly, "about the bet, about why it mattered so much to me." Clara looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. "And what did you realize?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I think it was more about proving myself to everyone else," he said finally. "I needed to show that I could be more than just Lucas Marshall, the guy with the fancy car and the penthouse." Clara set her book down, crossing to sit beside him. "And now?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Now I know that I am more," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "Because I have you. Because we're building something real." The corner of Clara's mouth lifted in a smile. "I knew you'd get there eventually," she said, her voice full of love and encouragement. Ethan leaned in, pressing his lips to hers in a slow, meaningful kiss. It was a promise, a declaration of their love and their commitment to each other. "I love you, Clara," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too, Ethan," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "And I'm ready for whatever comes next." As they lay in bed that night, the lights of the city streaming through their windows, Ethan and Clara spoke about their dreams for the future, the real future they were going to create together. They talked about buying a house, having children, and the adventures they would share. "We're not just surviving anymore," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "We're living, really living, and it feels incredible." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft with love. "Because we chose each other," she said simply. "That's all that matters." And with that, they drifted off to sleep, their hands clasped tightly together, ready to face whatever the next chapter of their lives would bring. As their lives settled into a new rhythm, Ethan and Clara's bond grew stronger. They were no longer just partners in a bet, but a team, navigating the complexities of their shared future. Yet even as they moved forward together, the shadow of their past lingered, casting a long shadow over their new beginning. Ethan's days at the community center were fulfilling, but not without challenges. He was faced with situations that tested his patience and his ability to truly listen. Understand the struggles of those less fortunate. Each day was a reminder of his old life, the one filled with luxury and privilege. It was a constant balancing act between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. One afternoon, as Ethan was leaving the center, he bumped into an old friend from his past. Andrew, the friend who had once been his closest confidant. Andrew looked taken aback when he saw Ethan, his eyes scanning him from head to toe, no doubt registering the change in his appearance. "Ethan," Andrew said, his voice laced with surprise, "I didn't expect to see you here." Ethan forced a smile, trying to mask the unease he felt. Yeah, well, things have changed, he replied, his tone nonchalant. What about you? Andrew hesitated, looking around as if searching for the right words. I heard about your bet, he said finally, his voice low, about how you went through all that. It's crazy, man. Ethan shrugged, trying to brush it off. It was just something to prove, he said, his voice steady. It doesn't matter now. But Andrew's eyes narrowed, his gaze penetrating. Doesn't matter, he repeated, his voice sharp. Ethan, you're still trying to prove something, aren't you? To everyone else. To yourself? Ethan's stomach tightened. Maybe, he admitted reluctantly. But it's not like it used to be. Andrew leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. Ethan, what are you really looking for? He asked softly. What's the end game here? Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I don't know, he confessed finally, his voice a whisper. I thought I did, but it's all different now. Andrew pushed off from the wall, closing the distance between them. Look, he said earnestly, I don't care about the bet. I just want to know if you're happy, really happy. Ethan's eyes met his, a flicker of vulnerability passing between them. I am, he said after a moment, his voice steady. But it's not the life I expected. Andrew's expression softened, his gaze filled with understanding. Maybe that's the point, Ethan, he said gently. Sometimes what we need isn't what we thought we wanted. Ethan took a deep breath, considering Andrew's words. Maybe, he said finally, but it's still a lot to figure out. Andrew clapped him on the shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile. Take it one day at a time, he advised. You've got Clara now, and that's the most important thing. Back at the apartment, Ethan found Clara in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, comforting and familiar. As he walked in, Clara looked over her shoulder, her face lighting up when she saw him. Hey, she greeted him with a warm smile. How was your day? Ethan leaned against the counter, his thoughts still preoccupied. It was interesting, he said slowly, his voice low. I ran into Andrew. Clara paused, her knife hovering over the cutting board. Oh, she asked, her expression carefully neutral. Ethan nodded, sighing heavily. He wanted to talk. About the bet, about what it all meant, he explained. And I don't know, Clara. I thought I had it all figured out, but now I'm not so sure. Clara set the knife down, crossing the kitchen to stand in front of him. Ethan, she said softly, taking his hands in hers, I know this hasn't been easy, but you've changed, so have I. We're building something real here, something that's not just about proving ourselves. Ethan looked down at their intertwined fingers, his voice quiet. I want this to be real, he said finally, his eyes meeting hers. But sometimes it feels like I'm fighting the old me. Clara squeezed his hands gently. And that's okay, she said gently. You don't have to have all the answers right now. We'll figure it out together. Ethan leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Thank you for understanding, he murmured. Clara's smile was soft and understanding. Always, she replied, her voice steady and full of love. We're in this for the long haul, Ethan, no matter what. As the days went by, Ethan and Clara found new ways to connect, simple moments that brought them closer together. They started a garden on their apartment's small balcony, planting flowers and vegetables they could enjoy together. It was a symbol of their growth, a reminder of the life they were building from scratch. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, looking out at the city below, Ethan turned to Clara, his voice serious. I'm scared, he admitted quietly. Scared that if I let go of the old me, I won't know who I am anymore. Clara took his hand, squeezing it gently. That's why we're doing this together, she said softly. You're not alone in this, Ethan. We're building something new, piece by piece. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I want to be better for you, he said, his voice resolute. For us. Clara smiled, leaning in to kiss him gently. You already are, she whispered against his lips. Every day, you're learning who you really are. As they watched the sun set over the city, Ethan knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. No bet, no expectations, just two people building a life from scratch, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. As Ethan and Clara approached the end of their 6-month journey, they were faced with a choice. Continue their bet, fulfill its terms, and return to their old lives, or take the risk of something deeper, something real. The final chapter of their story was about to unfold, and it would define their future together. The morning sunlight poured through the apartment's large windows, casting a warm glow over Ethan and Clara as they sat at the kitchen table, the remains of breakfast still in front of them. For the first time, there was no tension in the air, only a sense of quiet contemplation as they looked at each other across the table. "Today's the day," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty about what the future held. Clara reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Yeah," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "It is." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing against her skin. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers for an answer. Clara took a deep breath, considering her words carefully. "I want to make a new promise," she said finally, her gaze unwavering. "One that's not about a bet, not about winning or losing. I want us to choose each other, for real." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at her words. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about the bet anymore, Clara. It's about us." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Yes," she replied firmly. "It's about us, what we're building together, not what we've lost." For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had never been one to take risks, always preferring the security of what he knew. But with Clara he felt different, braver, more willing to embrace the unknown. "I don't know what's going to happen," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion, "but I know I want to try, really try, to make this work." Clara smiled, her eyes soft with love and understanding. "That's all I need to hear," she said gently. "Let's leave the bet behind us and focus on what's next." Ethan took a deep breath, his grip on her hand tightening. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Later that day, Ethan and Clara found themselves in a small, intimate ceremony, the kind of event they would have never chosen before the bet. The room was filled with friends and family, everyone who had supported their journey over the past 6 months. As they exchanged vows, there were no grand speeches, no grand gestures, just simple promises spoken from the heart. Ethan's voice wavered slightly as he said his vows, his eyes fixed on Clara's. "Clara, I promise to be there for you, through the good times and the bad," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions he was feeling. "I promise to listen, to learn, and to always be by your side." Clara's voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. "Ethan, I promise to be your partner, no matter what," she replied, her voice filled with love. "I promise to stand by you, to grow with you, and to face whatever comes next, together." The officiant's words were simple and poignant. "Today you're not just ending a bet," he said, his voice gentle. "You're beginning a new chapter, one that's about love, commitment, and partnership." As the ceremony concluded, Ethan and Clara exchanged rings, a symbol of their new beginning, a fresh start, free from the constraints of the bet. They kissed, sealing their promises with a gesture that spoke louder than words. As they walked out of the ceremony, hand in hand, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The bet was behind them, but the journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, adjusting to a new life, blending their pasts, and building a future together. But for the first time, they were facing those challenges not as competitors, but as partners. "I love you, Ethan," Clara whispered as they stepped into the sunlight, her fingers laced with his. "And I know we can do this, together." Ethan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "I love you too, Clara," he replied, his voice steady. "Let's build something real, something that's just ours." As they walked away from the ceremony, the weight of their past lifted. They were no longer bound by a bet, but by a choice. One that was based on love, trust, and the promise of a future together. And as they looked ahead, they knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it hand in hand. The story of Ethan and Clara wasn't just about proving something to others, it was about finding themselves, redefining what they wanted from life, and building something that was truly theirs. Their bet had turned into a journey of self-discovery, one that had shown them that sometimes, the greatest challenge is learning to be true to oneself and to each other.